Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. I welcome you to the continuation of the end of racism conversation about how we can bring about an end to systemic racism here in the United States and around the world, using as the example the best of examples, and that is the life and the very practical steps that were taken to end tribalism and racism by the Prophet Muhammad. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. When we talk about racism, we understand it as being not just something that was created here in the United States or something that was even initiated in Europe. We understand that the first racist was none other than the common mortal enemy that we have as all men and women, and that is Satan or Shaitan. Allah says in the Quran, وَإِذْ قُلْنَا لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ اسْجُدُوا لِآدَمَ فَسَجَدُوا إِلَّا إِبْلِيسَ أَبَى وَاسْتَكْبَرَ وَكَانَ مِنَ الْكَافِرِينَ. Allah says that He commanded all of the creation to show respect to Adam because He created Adam uniquely from any other creation. And so out of respect, all the other creation, including the angels and the jinn, were ordered to show their respect. But Iblis, or Satan, refused. And he said, "Khalaqtani min an-nar wa khalaqtahu min al-tin." He said, "You created." He said, "Ana khayrun minhu wa khalaqtani min al-nar wa khalaqtahu min al-tin." I'm better than him because you've created me out of fire. I can shape shift. I can, influence people. I can do all these things that you've allowed me to do. And this guy is just created out of clay. How can he be better than me? And Allah said, "A'lamu ma la ta'lamun." I know what you don't know. And so this is the story. This is the idea that racism sprang forth from. And many people have stated that those who actually were founding this country at the very beginning, when there were riots and there were actually, we talk about race riots going on now. Well, at the beginning of this country, there were actually rebellions where the slave class, which were both Africans, Europeans, and Native Americans, were rallying together to overthrow the plantations and overthrow the colonial powers. And so it was stated that some historians say that the people who were in charge, the aristocrats, were also, devil worshippers. And so they were taught literally how to divide the slave classes apart from one another through the institution of a caste system that gave more privileges to certain members of the slave class based upon their skin color. The first time that this had ever happened, and that is from that historic perspective over 400 years, we get to where we are right now. And so the question is how do we go from this? And we have found an answer, and that is the life and the legacy of the Prophet Muhammad, and the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, and the way he brought his grassroots movement together in a way that transcended racism, in a way that transcended sexism, in a way that transcended even classism. And so that's the conversation that we're presenting to you today. And we have a wonderful specifically with a really riveting conversation about someone who dedicated himself to ending racism and following in the footsteps of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that is none other than Imam Jamil Al-Amin. And Imam Jamil Al-Amin had built a successful track record of serving the people, starting from his time as a student leader, and then he continued that work in Atlanta and building the Atlanta Muslim community. And his story is riveting. And to talk about that story, we have none other than an author of a biography about the life and legacy of Imam Jamil Al-Amin, and that is El-Hajj Mauri Saalakhan, who's with us. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh Mauri. How are you doing?
Alaikum salam, Aki. I'm doing fine. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah.
First of all, we are in a pandemic, and I don't think we can go on without realizing how grateful it is that we're both alive. First of all, how are you and your family, and how's the pandemic impacting you and your life?
Alhamdulillah, we're holding up by the grace and mercy of Allah Ta'ala. We're trying to extract as much conscious benefit from this circumstance as we can. A few weeks back, I had a conversation on our broadcast platform, Salam Media, with Sheikh Abdullah Hakim Quick out of Canada. And one of the very insightful observations that he made during the course of our conversation was that we are living at a time when there is an opportunity for a reset. That's how he worded it, an opportunity for a reset. And I thought that was a very insightful way of describing this period that the global community is in right now. It is an opportunity for a reset. We have to take advantage of the circumstance that has been imposed upon us by this pandemic, recognizing that no calamity occurs except by the permission of Allah, and then using the faculties that Allah Ta'ala has given us to chart a different course than the one that we were on before this pandemic hit. This is an opportunity for a reset. So I'm trying to the best of my ability to take advantage of it. It's a punishing wake-up call for America and the world. And, we pray to Allah Ta'ala that those among us of sincere inclination will be able to benefit from this period of challenge that we are in.
Well, I think that this is a really interesting point that we can kind of take off from, because one of the additional challenges that we have recently witnessed is the death of one of the so-called stalwarts of the civil rights movement, and that is Congressman John Lewis. And Congressman John Lewis has really created, I think, a much needed debate around the history of the civil rights movement, and particularly in the context of the current, reawakening of people around the conversations on where we stand as a nation as it relates to Black people and the divisions, again, the division that separate us all. And in particular, there was a remark that was made during the funeral of Congressman John Lewis by former President Bill Clinton. And in fact, instead of me trying to explain it, let me go to that clip and give everybody a chance to listen to it themselves. I'm going to give everybody and allow you to do that by sharing my screen here, and you just tell me how you feel about it, because I think that you probably feel the same as I do. And let's go and listen to it.
Is the volume up on your side, brother?
Let me see. You can't hear it?
I can't. I could barely hear it on my end. Now I can't hear it at all.
Okay, let me just make sure. The sound. Can you see it?
I can see it. Yes.
Okay. Let's see. Let's see. Huh.
Disagrees with the
So,
overall
are you able to hear it now?
Yes, much better. And we just went back down.
So let's go back, because again, I think that the importance of the conversation is so significant that we would do if we left it there. So let's go back to the Lewis piece with the actual beginning of the interview. And I'll pull it up here now so you can see it, and then and give us your impression. So here we go. So let's try this again. This is a work in progress. We have a broadcasting that is filled with interesting twists, but let's go for this once more. Okay. All right. So let's go to there. Okay, let's go there.
Unfortunately, on my end at least, it's still not clear. So maybe if you can paraphrase what Clinton said, Aki.
Got it.
And justice. That was a big part of his identity, and he really did want to fight for the powerless. And so during the civil rights era, what he did was essentially eventually join.
Again, this is the nature of broadcasting, and I would hope that the reason we started having problems wasn't because our content was so riveting and powerful. It very much is really in line with what moment ago before we lost the stream, and that is that the controversy really evolves around how do we confront this issue of changing the society. And what at Congressman John Lewis's funeral, what was being stated was that during the funeral, that Clinton suggested that John Lewis represented a kind of soft, change in the movement. That he again represented the strictly nonviolent wing of the activism that was paramount to bringing about an end of at least some forms of racism, totally not all of the forms of racism. And Stokely Carmichael and Imam Jamil Al-Amin, as we'll hear, represented another kind of branch. And again, Brother Mauri Saalakhan, who can you hear me, Brother Saalakhan?
I can hear you now, yes.
Great. And we were just talking about, again, the dichotomy between the more soft approach to ending racism as exemplified by John Lewis and the more zealous efforts as had been epitomized by Stokely Carmichael and following him, that is Imam Jamil Al-Amin. So I think that gives us a good starting point. And can you tell me, first of all, what is the relationship between Stokely Carmichael, John Lewis, and Imam Jamil Al-Amin? Were they all a part of some organization? Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yes, they were all a part of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which later modified its name, had its name modified to the Student National Coordinating Committee under It was either Stokely or under H. Rap Brown. It was one of the two. But if the name had not if it was had not been modified under Kwame, the process for modifying the name and also the approach taken by SNCC began certainly under Kwame and reached its fruition under H. Rap Brown. There were philosophical differences that ended up emerging between some of the members of the SNCC organization, as I understand it. It began.
Excuse me, you mentioned H-Rap. First of all, I think you have two streams going, so that if you could disable one of the streams, that probably would help. Second of all, you mentioned H-Rap Brown. Can you explain for a lot of our viewers who this H-Rap Brown is? Because a lot of people don't know who you're talking about.
Okay, let me, okay, I see a smaller screen at the bottom here. Let me see if I can. Now, if I click on remove from stream, I hope this is not going to cut me off completely.
Yeah, no, don't do that.
Just did it.
Yeah,
okay.
Just but you're good.
Okay,
all right. We have probably on a YouTube broadcast as well as this. So I'm saying just keep this one. Just look at this platform.
All right.
All right. Go. So Ken, can you explain who is this H-Rap Brown of which you just spoke?
Okay, it's important for folk to know that Imam Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin, before his embrace of Islam, he was known as H-Rap Brown. He was a young firebrand. If you were to pick up any well-made documentary on the African-American human rights movement, and I use this terminology for a reason, you know, one of the a reflection of the wisdom of the deeper insights of the late Imam Mu'addin Muhammad, may Allah be pleased with him, is reflected in one of the statements that he had become known for: words make people. You know, us using it's one of the reasons why I reject and I encourage young Muslims especially to reject the label civil rights activists. I mean, you have a lot of young Muslim and non-Muslim activists that seem to prefer to identify as civil rights activists when in fact when you do that, you're limiting yourself. This is something that was recognized many decades ago. The first one of the revolutionary spirited leaders that emphasized this point for me was Robeson and then Malcolm. Malcolm was known to refer to the struggle of Black folk in this country as a human rights struggle, and he wanted to internationalize it as a human rights struggle. Even the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., before his assassination in 1968, he had come to the point of referencing the human rights struggle, not just of the Vietnamese people, but also African Americans here. So it's very, very important for us to use the correct type of language when we talk about these issues. But at SNCC, the SNCC organization, they came to a fork in the road within and among the young activists that were part of that organization's growth and development. John Lewis was, if I'm not mistaken, he succeeded Marion Barry. Marion Barry, I believe, was the first chairman of SNCC, and then John Lewis followed him, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, for our research, it appears that we have John Lewis, first of all, Marion Barry being the first chairman, second of all, being John Lewis, third of all being Stokely
Kwame
Carmichael,
Ture.
Kwame
Stokely
Ture,
Carmichael, yeah.
And then third of all being H.Rap Brown or Imam Jamil Al-Amin.
So what ended up happening, as I understand it, is that, you know, during the process for election, when it came time for re-election within the SNCC organization, Stokely ended up besting out John Lewis, and my understanding is this kind of left a bad taste, for John Lewis. He didn't, it was kind of a bitter loss for him, but it also symbolized a change in direction of the organization where it was going to become even more militant. And in fact, Kwame Ture and then later H.Rap Brown, before he embraced Islam in 1971 and metamorphized into Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin. These were the two representatives of a more militant, even more militant expression of the activism within that organization. And like I said, they ended up modifying the name of the organization from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to the Student National Coordinating Committee. And then under Kwame Ture, there was also an effort made to discourage whites, young white students and what have you, from being members of the organization.
And can you speak actually to the point you made a minute ago, and that was specifically to the story of the militancy, because some people think that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Community or Committee rather, or the Student National Coordinating Committee, depending upon its year, that it was not militant. But you described something something different, that in fact the organization may have been considered from even an inception militancy, but there was different type of militancy. Can you explain? And I think that the movie Selma depicts some of the militancy, and these are. And can you describe like some of the actions and how old were these young people when they were doing some of these actions?
Well, members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, I mean, they were young. Probably the average age was, probably 20. There were younger members of the SNCC organization. There were younger members in their teens, and then there were older members in their early to mid 20s. But it was a young organization. It was a student nonviolent activist-oriented organization, and they were militant. I mean, it was militant from day one. It was a very militant organization, but it was a militancy that was predicated on the use of the weapon of creative nonviolence. But compared to the other civil rights organizations that were present at that time, SNCC was militant. SNCC was a militant organization. They engaged in very militant action. They were one of the primary instruments of struggle. One of their primary methodologies of struggle were the sit-ins, which was a very, very militant and dangerous thing to do, especially in different parts of the South. It was a very dangerous thing to do. And it required a tremendous amount of courage to decide that, you're going to go into an establishment in a downtown southern city, whether it be Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and you're going to sit at a lunch counter that is reserved for whites only. And you're going to sit there and make a request for service and refuse to move, even after you've been denied that service. And in many cases, invite the violent ire of other folk who are within that establishment, who are in that restaurant or in at the inside the Woolworths a 5 and 10 cent store at the lunch counter, and with other whites becoming aware of the of what's happening inside, and them coming in, and just beginning to do some very violent things to maybe 2 or 3 or a half dozen students who are engaged in this nonviolent sit-in, both male and female. I mean, that was very militant. It required a tremendous amount of courage, a tremendous amount of heart, and I mean, the Mauri Saalakhan that you see here today, I wouldn't have been able to do that. And so yeah, it was very, very militant. It was very militant. But then, and another example of the militancy, how militant it was, and how militant the young members of that organization came to symbolize. During the 1963 March on Washington, a young John Lewis, who I believe was about 23 years of age, if I'm not mistaken, at that time, during the March on Washington, he, subhanAllah, he received pressure from the older, more senior leaders connected to what were referred to as the Big Six organizations, the large civil rights organization, the major civil rights organization. He received pressure to tone down the speech that, if my memory serves me correct, he was the last one to deliver. I think he was the last speaker on that day. And they put pressure on him to kind of tone down the speech because they considered it to be a bit too demanding. So again, yeah, they were a militant organization, and one should not sleep on the militancy simply because they were that their methodology was creative nonviolence.
And so now that we have gotten that background on the organizations that John Lewis and Kwame Ture, also known as Stokely Carmichael, and Imam Jamil Al-Amin, also known as H. Rap Brown, all led, why don't we take a different track? And going back to the theme of our conversation, which is the end of racism, can you, first of all, bring us the story of how you embraced Islam? Was it in line with the story of Imam Jamil Al-Amin, of how he embraced Islam as he was struggling against racism? Is that what led you to enter into the fold of Islam?
My entry into the fold of Islam, the beginning of my journey began with the Nation of Islam, Temple number 41 in Bridgeport, Connecticut. My family had moved after the riots, the 68 riots. My family moved that following spring, April of 1969, to Bridgeport, Connecticut. And part of the reason was, to give the entire family, but especially me, because I was the oldest of my brothers and sisters. I was the oldest, and I had already begun to get in trouble. And they were concerned about me, and they were, concerned about the condition that the city of Camden, New Jersey was in as a result of the riots that just destroyed, parts of the city, destroyed the downtown, parts of neighborhoods, and they just saw an opportunity in one of the, northeastern industrial cities. I mean, that was when Bridgeport was still considered to be, one of the industrial hubs of the Northeast. And, it sat right on the port, and there were, quite a number of factories in the city, and, so, blue collar work was plentiful at that time, and it represented a clean break, a break that the family needed, but especially the oldest son. And so we moved to Bridgeport, Connecticut. And I remember on my way, on the way into Bridgeport, as we were driving from New Jersey, I had made a promise to my mother that, I was going to do better. I was going to try my best to do better, to stay out of trouble. And I did pretty well up until when the next school year started, and not Camden, but Central High School in Bridgeport, Connecticut. This was a time in 1969. The late 60s, all into the early to mid 70s, there was a lot of overt racial strife. And one of the ways it manifested itself in Bridgeport was, and a number of other cities, not just Bridgeport, was, the conflicts that took place, at integrated schools. So Central High was an integrated high school. It was predominantly white, but, there was a growing number of African Americans, myself included, that found its way through their doors. And I'll never forget the very first week of high school, there was a fight between blacks and whites, and a number of us ended up being not just suspended, but expelled. I was told later, I don't know if this was true, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was, that only the black students, myself included, got expelled. I had messed up in Camden in the year before coming to moving to Bridgeport. And I had gotten left back a grade as a result of just messing up. Up until I experienced a tragedy in my life, something that was really, it was traumatic. And it was after that experience that I ended up, just going off the rails. And but up until that time, I was an honor student. I was an honor student all through elementary school into junior high. And then I just went off the rails toward the end. While I was still in junior high, I kind of went off the rails after that traumatic experience, and that's when I started getting into trouble. So when we moved to Bridgeport, Connecticut, I got expelled. That put me back 2 years, and I just had too much pride to want to go back to school 2 years behind. And so what I ended up doing was, I told my parents, my mother and my stepfather, I didn't want to go back to school. And so it was, okay, if you're not going to go back to school, you're going to have to work. Just can't sit around. You can't, and so I ended up going to work. And then I worked on, I got a GED guidebook from the library, and I studied the GED guidebook, and I ended up taking the test about a year later. And then I ended up graduating with, some other stuff happened. I went and visited my father.
The question I have, though, going back to the original point, is how did you come about embracing Islam? I
the autobiography of Malcolm X.
Okay.
So it started my journey. It started, at first I went into the Black Panther Party. I was a young teenager in the Black Panther Party, New Haven, Connecticut chapter. I was there. I saw things that disturbed me after about 6 months. And I would later learn, in looking back, that I was seeing the effects of COINTELPRO. So I saw things. I left the Black Panther Party, and then I started noticing the brothers with the bow ties in the community with the bean pie, with the bean pies and the newspapers, Muhammad Speaks. I remember the book that I read when I got locked up and the autobiography of Malcolm X, that led me to Temple Number 41. I made the decision to just join because I wanted a change. I wanted a different direction in my life. I really wanted that, and I was inspired by Malcolm. I was inspired by him, and so that was what began my journey. And then in 1975, I moved to Washington D.C., and the rest, as they say, is history. And in fact, when I moved to Washington in the summer of 75, if you remember the history, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad passed away in February of 75, and his son Imam Wahiduddin Muhammad began that transition period. So that was my path.
Journey. And speaking of that journey, let me ask, in terms of your experiences, you spoke a little bit about the racism that you received prior to becoming Muslim. As you talk about the transition between the Nation of Islam and to the leadership of a more orthodox approach to Islam, what have you noticed in terms of whether or not, the idea that both Malcolm or El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz spoke of when he first traveled to Mecca for Hajj, talking about the season where we're now currently in, and it's the Hajj season. From my recollection of the autobiography of which you spoke, he talked about how Islam had been painted for him as being only for the black man. And when he arrived in Mecca, he saw people of all colors, from the darkest of dark from Sudan to the whitest of white in the Caucasus Mountains of Europe. And he talked about the Asians that he saw. And so this universality is something that he was attracted by. But since that time, fast forward from 50 years ago, or maybe 55 years ago, as you talk about the journey of El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz taking place in the Hajj of 1963, as I recall.
64.
64, okay. How, has that experience translated to the way in which Islam is being practiced and lived here in America, particularly with the inhabitants, particularly of those countries that he he was surrounded by, in terms of the people from Hajj coming from these countries, pretty much the same people who were on Hajj, their children or their relatives are now populating the United States. But is that level of brotherhood and sisterhood that he saw on Hajj, is that exhibited? And has that been your experience? Or what has been your experience?
Yeah, my experience has been mixed, and I believe that a proper analysis of this question would be to conclude that the results or the answer to that question is mixed. Certainly, the Muslim world today is very different from the Muslim world during the time of El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. In fact, Malcolm's 64 experience was, of course, very different from the experience that he had had a few years earlier. This 64 wasn't the first time for Malcolm seeing, Muslims of many different tribes, of many different colorations. It wasn't his first time. He paved the way for a international visit, and I believe it might have been for pilgrimage, for the Hajj or for Umrah. He paved the way for the Honorable Elijah Muhammad back in 1959, and so he saw, the reality of Islam in terms of the brotherhood then. But, and this is a very important point here, the mindset of Malcolm from 1959 to 1964 was a very different mindset. It was a very different mindset. I would describe Malcolm of 64 because of what he was going through. After his suspension and then coming to the realization that it was more than a suspension, that he was not going to be welcomed back into the fold. His decision to establish the two organizations, Muslim Mosque Inc. and the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and his subsequent Hajj. I mean, all of this ended up being a life-saving process. And I emphasize life-saving where it matters most. Malcolm's spirit, his consciousness. Allah Ta'ala lifted the veils off of Malcolm. So it enabled him to see in 1964 what he was not able to see in 1959 when he paved the way for Mr. Elijah Muhammad's visit. He was able to see something very different. He was open to the pure message of Islam. And the Muslim world, like I said, was very different then than it is today. Today, we are living in a more globalized spectrum. The world has shrunk considerably, and the reach of Uncle Sam and other wannabe empires, former empires, the British, the French, Rome, Italy, I should say, and their influence is felt in every corner of the world. And with that influence, Aki, it has contaminated the hearts and minds of many of the natives, who, especially those who dwell in the cities and those who have the resources to travel abroad and to be educated abroad, and basically to be miseducated, to be trained, and to be secularized, and to be basically set up to be used as tools for the empires that they end up serving. So the mindset of the Muslim world, generally speaking, is very different. What I found when I was in Mecca, this has been my experience when I visited other parts of the so-called developing world, or the third world, as they like to say, is that the farther you get away from the cities, the more you come in contact with people, with Muslims especially, that have more of their Islamic nature intact. And that's what I found. That's what I found. That was my experience in Arabia. That was my experience in Senegal, West Africa, when I was there. It's my experience in Pakistan when I visited there. The farther you get away from the cities, into the countryside, into the rural areas, you come into contact with people that are closer to their fitra. They're less contaminated by what comes in from the West. They're less contaminated.
And so those people, I guess if you were going to kind of like draw a parallel, your thought is that the people of the 1960s, particularly 1964, who were embracing Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, that these people, in large part, that were people from outside the more rural communities, and so what he experienced was the embrace of people whose natural spirit was Islamic, as opposed to those people who, had he been around a lot of folks from the cities, wherever they might have been, he may not have felt that level of brotherhood. And so you're saying, fast forward, that many of the people who have inhabited the United States from these countries over the past 55 years have largely come from the big cities as opposed to the rural communities. And so therefore they've brought their, almost they brought their patterns of emulating, the people in power and how they treat, particularly Black people, and how they separate, people based upon race. And so these people have embraced that, and that's the reason why we have such division in our community now. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, many of the folk who have come into the United States post Malcolm, and especially I would say from the late 70s, early 80s on, have more of a Western and Westernized influence. Because even during Malcolm's time, I mean, when you look back at the 60s, Aki, when you look back during that period, this was a very, very turbulent period, not just for the United States, but for the world. There was a tremendous amount of revolutionary fervor in the atmosphere. You had many countries during the 50s, from the 50s into the 60s and early 70s that were winning their independence. It was a very revolutionary period. And so, but even in the cities, even among some of the leaders who were able to leave different parts of Africa and different parts of Asia and study abroad, whether it was in the United States or Europe, they did it. They studied through the prism of a revolutionary kind of agenda. They were very different. The atmosphere was very different. So even from many of the cities, I mean, King Faisal, who was over Saudi Arabia, was probably one of the most, one of the better of the Saudi monarchs. He was one of the better, one of the more revolutionary, and he was the one that accommodated Malcolm, that rolled out the red carpet for Malcolm. And you had I mean, this was a very fertile period in terms of revolutionary fervor. I mean, it was a very, very fertile period. And so
it's almost kind of like the period in which we find ourselves now. People look at protesting racism as being popular, and so therefore people are willing to say things that maybe they're not willing to say. And so as we talk about that, let's bring it back to the Imam Jamil story. I mean, so you mentioned that Imam Jamil embraced Islam. How did he embrace Islam? And take us quickly through that history and where. First of all, can you explain, that story, just briefly as possible, because I know it's a very lengthy story. You probably take you've written a book about it, but please do your best.
One of the things that is valuable about this book, one of the things that's most valuable, in my opinion, is the chronology that we got from Sister Karima. I had asked her for assistance in publishing a chronology, we have a chapter that represents a chronology of Imam Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin from his days as H. Rap Brown, from his emergence as H. Rap Brown, all the way through his embrace of Islam, and actually all the way through the tragedy of March 2000, when he became embroiled in this unfortunate tragedy that has him where he is today.
And where is he right now? Because I don't think people may know.
Right now, Imam Jamil is at a in a federal prison in Tucson, Arizona, for most of his years of imprisonment, and he's now in his he's approaching his 21st year. For most of his years, Imam Jamil was in the Supermax, America's only Supermax prison, underground. And so But quickly,
So,
Imam Jamil.
but can you explain? You said that Imam Jamil, why is he in prison, and why is he in a federal prison? Can you explain that?
Yeah, he is. An incident occurred on the eve of Eid al-Adha. On the eve of Eid al-Adha in March of 2000. Some deputies, sheriff's deputies, came to the west end of Atlanta, where the community mosque, which was established by Imam Jamil and those who followed him, and where he lived on the west end of Atlanta. They came to serve a warrant that never should have been issued. It was never should have been issued. They ended up getting into a gunfight. It was after 10 o'clock at night with an assailant who they believed, they later identified as being Imam Jamil, but the description that they initially gave, the deputy that was killed, as well as the one who survived, and the various evidential markers surrounding that tragedy pointed to someone else. And in fact, there was a man by the name of a younger man by the name of Otis Jackson, also known as by the last name Santos. I forgot his first name, but he confessed to being the person. In fact, I had a conversation with him a few years later in another lockup. He confessed to being the person who got into the gunfight with the sheriff's deputies and killed one, seriously injured the other. They wanted Imam Jamil.
Can I let me go back? So let's go back to this point of you saying how this other person who confessed to you, how when they came to serve the warrant upon Imam Jamil, how did this person, how was he at the house of Imam Jamil, and how did the gun battle ensue? Can you explain? What did he share with you about that?
By his description of what happened, he said that he had come to the West End because he wanted to talk with Imam Jamil. He wanted to
he'd come to the West End Masjid.
To the West End Masjid because he wanted to confer with Imam Jamil. He said that while he and another brother was, he gave a couple of descriptions. On one occasion, he said when he was, he and another brother, and he said Imam Jamil had arrived, and they were talking, and then he said that the sheriff's deputies, the two sheriff's deputies, pulled up on them. He said that he didn't like the way they were speaking to Imam Jamil, and he just lost it. Now, this man he clearly is someone who is not very stable, and no doubt this is the reason why he's been in and out of jails and prisons. But he said that he got into the first an argument and then into a gunfight with the two sheriff's deputies, and he gave a description of some of the things that unfolded that only someone who had been there would know. And but
so was he struck?
Yeah, in fact he was struck, and one of the contradictions to the government's case was that there was a blood trail. There was a blood trail that led from the area of encounter to an abandoned house right around the corner. Based upon that blood trail, when the APB went out, the All Points Bulletin went out for Imam Jamil, one of the things that was announced was that he was wounded.
Right.
He was wounded. And they were shocked when 3 days later, when they took him into custody in Alabama, he had no wounds.
And the reason why I thought that was important to describe and to share is because two things. One, I was a young lawyer during that time period, and I remember being at a home of one of our Muslim leaders here, and him telling me we were at the home for our Eid dinner, post-Eid dinner, and we had these little halakas or gatherings and of Muslim professionals, and he told me that he had just gotten a call from Imam Jamil, who was basically being charged with this shooting, and Imam Jamil needed to talk to a lawyer. And I had, was a newly minted lawyer and never handled a criminal case ever before, but other than handling some, criminal citations against me for the police would say that I was, either loitering during a protest or, some type of thing such as that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, had never had that experience. So, I was asked to get on the phone with Imam Jamil and talk with him and give him some counseling as a lawyer. And so, I did it, mainly because Imam Jamil I knew firsthand.
Mm-hmm.
I had known him, first of all, because my father was also a member and a leader in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Okay.
And so they had been colleagues. And my father, Imam Jamil's name was a household name. Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, Huey Newton, Eldridge Cleaver, all these guys were, names that we grew up with knowing because my parents had been in the movement at that time. Second of all, I had a chance and opportunity to meet Imam Jamil on a couple of occasions, as I recall. One, the last of which was, I had a chance to visit the West End Masjid, and I think I met him there. But the last occasion was at the tribute to Kwame Ture, or Stokely Carmichael, in which he was a speaker, and we got a chance to meet with him there. And I can tell you that when he walked in, this was a story that I'll never forget. He walked into this room filled with leaders. Congressman John Lewis was there, and other members of Congress were there. Business leaders from BET and all the people of that time. This is in the 90s. Which some would say was a heyday for Black entrepreneurism, and so I was there in this this ballroom in Washington D.C. I think the Washington Hilton Hotel, and here comes in this robed African American but looked like he was from the deserts of Sudan, and literally. The way he walked into the room was like literally he was a prince of the desert, coming with a great wisdom to share and impart upon everybody, and everybody looked to this man because he literally took the room away in terms of their who he was, and so this is the scene. And I had a chance to, I introduced myself. I went up to him and asked him what his name was, and he told me his name was Imam Jamil Al-Amin, also known as H. Rap Brown. And I told him about how my father and he were colleagues, and he remembered my father, and he gave me the salams, and that was our brief encounter. And so when I was back on the phone with him about maybe 5 years later, after that point, he explained to me that he wasn't the person who had who shot the officers, and they said that he had been shot in terms of the APB as you described, and he wasn't shot, and he said this was the evidence that should clear his name, and I thought at that time that it would clear his name, but sadly it did not, and now that was in 2000, and now this is 2020. So the Hajj of 2000 is when Imam Jamil was arrested, and now this is the Hajj of 2020. So
That's
Imam
right.
Jamil has been in jail for now 20 years, and we ask Allah, and I pray for Imam Jamil oftentimes, almost every day, from that time until now. Regularly ask Allah to free him from prison. So let me ask you, why, with that type of evidence that you just shared with me, why is it that he's in jail?
Because Imam Jamil clearly, he was targeted. Imam Jamil had remained a target from the time that he left prison to moving to Atlanta, Georgia, and beginning the laying the foundations for the community, for the Jamaat that he would lead. All of those years, he remained a target. And in fact, you know, since the tragedy that unfolded on the west end of Atlanta in March of 2000, since that tragedy, I've had plenty of time to do a lot of research around Imam Jamil and this case, and beyond this case, you know, coming across documents and coming across testimonies that clearly indicate that Imam Jamil consistently remained a person who was under surveillance, and I would go further to say he was someone who remained a target.
Hold on, but can you explain that to us?
Yeah, I mentioned that the warrant, for example, the warrant that was being served that night, you know, serving a warrant, you know, that late at night on the eve of one of the two major Muslim holidays. It wasn't by chance. It was based upon a bogus foundation. Imam Jamil had purchased a vehicle. He had purchased a vehicle. He ended up being stopped. And looking back now, a number of us believe that when he was stopped, it was because he was profiled when he was stopped in that vehicle. So anyway, he was stopped. The officer who stopped him, you know, ran a check on the tags, determined that the tags were not legit, and the vehicle may have been stolen. And so he decided to place Imam Jamil under arrest. When he, you know, went through the whole process of searching him and what have you, he found in his wallet a badge. So in addition to the charge of driving a stolen vehicle and driving a vehicle without insurance, and on top of both of these charges, there was also the charge of impersonating a police officer. Later, Imam Jamil produced the papers for the vehicle he had just recently purchased, to prove that, you know, that was his vehicle. He owned that vehicle. It was not stolen. The badge was a badge that had been given to him by the mayor of Whitehall, Alabama. He and a number of his male members of the Jamaat were deputized by the mayor because they wanted the mayor, who went back many years with Imam Jamil from back in the quote unquote civil rights days in the movement. He had a lot of respect for Imam Jamil from those days, as well as a continued and in fact an even heightened level of respect because of what he had done in Atlanta. When Imam Jamil moved to Atlanta, the West End was one of the worst, if not the worst part of the town to live in. It was, you know, a red light zone. Imam Jamil and the Muslims who ended up following him and taking up residence and renting and buying property and, you know, just developing the Jamaat. they ended up cleaning up the West End to such a degree that during the trial, when Atlanta mayor, a former Atlanta mayor and former ambassador to the U.S. To the UN from the U.S., Andrew Young, when he took the stand in defense of Imam Jamil during after he was found guilty during the sentencing phase of the trial, one of the things that he said was that when his daughter decided that she was going to move to buy a house on the West End, if it had not been for Imam Jamil and what he and the Muslims had done on the West End, he would have been scared to death. But it was because of Imam Jamil, because of his presence, and because of what they had done in terms of cleaning up and stabilizing the West End, that he felt comfortable with his daughter buying a piece of property and moving to the West End. So that was.
And now, Mike, can you speak to the idea of how Imam Jamil built an ummah?
Yes,
it was beyond just the small masjid in the West End of Atlanta, wasn't it? Wasn't
that's right?
He associated, or did he not build a larger Muslim organization that spanned the entire country?
Yes, he did. He had members. There were members of Al Ummah, and there still are in different parts of the United States, and there were members abroad in a couple of the Caribbean islands. So yeah, I mean, Imam Jamil,
and MANA too, wasn't he also the chairman of MANA as well? And can you describe that organization?
I don't know if he was the chairman of MANA. What I do know, and in fact, I rather doubt that he was, but I do know that Imam Jamil had a tremendous amount of influence on the early evolution of MANA.
I don't know. I will push back, because I actually, my understanding was that Imam Jamil, before Imam Siraj, was the chairman of MANA, and they had, again, and when he was incarcerated initially, he was a center of their advocacy because he was their leader at the time.
Yeah.
And so that was, if my memory is not mistaken, that was the history. But, and again, MANA is the Muslim Association of North America, which is an organization of African American Muslim leaders, including Imam Siraj al-Hajj and other Muslim leaders across the country. And
the Muslim Alliance, the Muslim Alliance of North America.
Muslim Alliance of North America. And the great and late Hudari Abdullah Ali, Rahimatullah alayh, Allah have mercy upon him, was one of the leaders as well of that organization, and was very active in raising awareness about the plight of Imam Jamil. But in this context, and again, you can see that Imam Jamil's life is so deep, it's impossible to really talk about it in one episode. But let us, if you could, with that foundation laid, him being in jail, him being convicted as a result of, as you said, him being targeted, the role of now civil rights leaders like John Lewis, who's recently died, and Imam Jamil, what was the role of John Lewis in either in the efforts to bring justice to Imam Jamil's case after he was jailed? And again, you still never explain, how did John Lewis get from a charge of shooting a police officer, which, even if he was convicted, he was convicted, but even if he was guilty, would have only put him into a confinement in a state prison? How did he go from a state prison or a state charge into a federal prison? And what was the role of Congressman John Lewis, either in keeping him there or putting him there, or not freeing him? If you can explain.
I don't think, in fact, I'm quite certain that the late Congressman John Lewis had nothing to do with, no say in the in the process of convicting and then imprisoning Imam Jamil. The Imam Jamil ended up in a very unorthodox, truly out of the ordinary kind of circumstance, being transferred to from a state prison, which is where he belonged as a convicted felon in a state court, to a federal prison, and not just to any federal prison, to the worst of the worst of the worst. This is the only supermax prison in the United States, in Colorado.
It's where they put people who are supposedly the masterminds behind 9/11,
right,
and others so-called terrorist actions. So how did, again, somebody who was convicted of shooting police officers who are local police officers, how did he get placed in a federal penitentiary? In fact, the worst of all federal penitentiaries.
According to the folklore, according to the information on the street, it was one warden doing a favor for another warden. Two wardens who supposedly had a buddy-buddy relationship, and one doing a favor for the other. There was an incident that occurred in Reidsville, Georgia's supermax prison where Imam Jamil had been held. There was an incident that occurred. Actually, a couple of incidents. When word got around that Imam Jamil was at Reidsville, when word got around the inmate population, they wanted to make Imam Jamil their leader and spokesperson, both Muslims and non-Muslims who were in the prison. And I'm sure that the vast majority of them being African American, they wanted to make Imam Jamil their spokesperson, their leader, their representative in any grievance that they had with the administration.
Imam Jamil was how old at this time?
Huh?
How old was he at this time?
Imam Jamil was in his 50s. He was in his 50s. All right. That was point A. Point B was Imam Jamil, when he was at Reidsville, not only was he in maximum security, he was in solitary confinement. All right. Again, the word is that during that period when Imam Jamil would have his 1 hour out of the cell, the small cell that he was in, he would have it they would take him to an outdoor cage where that was only sunlight he would be able to get for that hour. And it just so happened that his hour was at the same time when they had another prisoner who was in solitary confinement in his cage. And this prisoner happened to be the leader of the Aryan Brotherhood. Well, over the course of a short amount of time, this leader of the Aryan Brotherhood, which is a white supremacist, organization that is heavily populated in prisons, in America's prisons, this man ended up embracing Islam.
SubhanAllah.
And I think the combination of these two things, it was like the final straw. It raised levels of concern, and they decided, okay, we need to do something with him, even though he is in solitary confinement in Georgia's maximum security prison. This is an indication that this is not enough confinement for our tastes, even then. And so, a decision was made to move him to America's supermax prison, which, was ended up being truly a violation of his human rights, especially given the conditions that he ended up being housed under, conditions that ended up causing him to become very ill after a number of years. He became very ill. And then there was a campaign to bring pressure, a campaign to bring attention and pressure to the fact that, he was in a situation where they were attempting to kill him by medical neglect. and as the pressures rose, and as a couple of prominent Black political leaders became involved in calling, for something to be done, he ended up being taken from the Supermax prison where he was housed to Butner, to the Federal Medical Center at Butner for treatment. And then after he was stabilized, because the pressure had been maintained, alhamdulillah, instead of them sending him back to the Supermax, initially they sent him to a federal prison in Pennsylvania. And then after a few months, when he complained about the cold, he made a request to be sent to a federal institution in Georgia, where he can be closer to his family and closer to his lawyers. They decided, okay, we'll move you, but we're going to move you even farther away. So they moved him to Arizona, and that's where he is now. But he's still under unofficial special administrative measures, where he does not have contact, with anyone on the outside except those on a very limited visitation list, his attorneys, and those on a very limited visitation list. He has no contact with anyone else on the outside. There are a number of professors from many colleges and universities around America and abroad who have become a part of this petition drive to the Bureau of Prisons for access to Imam Jamil. I've seen, the petition, well over 100.
And I can also add that when I was a senior member of the congressional staff, particularly on the Judiciary Committee, which oversees the Bureau of Prisons, the question, again, that we pose as Chief Counsel to Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee is, why is it that Imam Jamil could be kept in the federal prison? And we were told at that time it's because it was through a compact through the state of Georgia, that the state of Georgia would have to request that he be sent back, and that they were only basically adhering to their contract, if you will, their agreement to hold prisoners at the request. And so what we were trying to do is to get the Bureau of Prisons to rescind that holding, that agreement to hold him. And I believe that there still is an opportunity, that there can be action applied on the federal level to get the Bureau of Prison to transfer him back to the state of Georgia. That to me is at minimum. But then, can you bring us up to speed, because now we're getting to the end of our show, bring us up to speed on the Supreme Court case that was developed again after 20 years, and what happened with that?
Well, basically, the Supreme Court, after the Court of Appeals in Atlanta, Georgia, turned down, despite acknowledging the fact that Imam Jamil's constitutional rights were violated during the trial, even though they acknowledged that.
And what was the basis of the violation of the constitutional rights?
The most there were a number of points of violation, but the most important point was during the closing arguments, the prosecutor conducted a mock cross-examination of Imam Jamil in his closing arguments. Imam Jamil didn't take the stand. He exercised his constitutional right not to take the stand. And his position, I believe, was, that he did not, he was going to participate as little in those, railroad oriented proceedings as he possibly could. He got permission from the start of the trial not to stand, when the judge and the jury came into the courtroom, and he exercised his right not to take the stand, believing that the evidence was in his favor. And unfortunately, because of the nature of that case, the nature of that trial, the way that that trial was prosecuted.
And I think you forgot to mention that the trial, although he was again charged in 2000, when did the trial take place?
After 9/11.
Right. So it was after.
In fact,
so a year later.
Year and a half later, it hit 2002.
Right. And was it in 2002, not 2001, huh?
It was, okay. Yeah, it was in 2002. And, you know, but I mean, the aura of 9/11 was still.
It was in like January or February of 2002.
Yes,
right? So it was again still like in months after the attack in New York. And that was the backdrop of his conviction, right?
That's right. Correct? That's right. And so when the lead prosecutor conducted the mock cross-examination of Imam Jamil, you know, why didn't he answer this question? If he had taken a stand, he would have, this is why this. And at the end, you know, he said, he didn't stand for you. Don't stand for him. And so clearly, it was a very prejudicial, violative closing argument that you know the appeals court acknowledged. Yes, his constitutional rights were violated, but we don't think they were violated to such a degree that, you know, it prevented him from getting a fair trial, which is, you know, nonsensical, the double speak. The U.S. Supreme Court decided not to even hear his case.
So his lawyers took that appeal from the highest court of Georgia, which is the Court of Appeals, to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court, not one of the Supreme Court justices. He would have to at least get one Supreme Court justice to vote to hear his case, and not one decided that it warranted.
Apparently not one decided. And that brings us back also, brother. This is a very important point to the African American leadership. You know, back during the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, I was, of course, there on the grounds. It was a large demonstration. I don't know if you were there, but
I was there.
I was there. Alhamdulillah. It was a large demonstration. Even though I didn't speak, I was given access to the VIP section. I was there. I was able to talk with some of the leaders that were there. And one of the leaders I spoke to was Congressman John Lewis. And I remember specifically asking him, you know, Congressman Lewis, you're one of the, you know, you're one of the symbols of the movement. You knew Imam Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin back when he was H. Reb Brown. He's from your district. You represent him. Why haven't you said anything? Why haven't you done anything to bring attention to his plight? So I told him, I said, you know, respectfully, and I was very respectful in my tone. So you know, many of us are very disappointed. And I'll never forget, you know, he didn't respond. He just looked at me, and it was a look of, you know, you're right, but I don't know what was behind that but, because he never said anything. You know, but the expression on his face was one of, you know, accepting that, yes, you know, whatever the reason, only he knew what that was. Your criticism is correct. And I was very, very disappointed. And I've been very disappointed with the Congressional Black Caucus as a body that used to be known back in the day as the conscience of the Congress. You know, that they haven't done more. Imam Jamil is such a huge symbol. And this place and time that we're in right now, if those who are watching this, especially the young activists who see this broadcast, if they don't leave with anything else, the young activists across the board, beginning with African Americans, and Muslims, because Imam Jamil represents, his imprisonment has a double significance for us as African Americans, for our tribe as an African American people, and also for our tribe as a Muslim, as Muslims. There's a double significance. So it begins with us, but also for many of the good-hearted Caucasians that are out there, and the Latinos that are out there, and the South Asians and the Arabs, all the young people especially that are out there. We're living right now in a moment that I never would have believed I would see again in my lifetime. I was a child of the 60s. I never thought I would live to see a moment like we're in right now again. And this moment is even bigger, in my humble opinion, than the 60s were. But the engine behind it is still Black grievance, African American grievance, based upon, historical crimes against humanity that have been leveled against our people with little let up, from up until now. But Imam Jamil represents a symbol and an opportunity for us to respond in this time and help someone who represents a bridge between two generations of struggle. That's what he represents. The 60s, which is the 1960s, one of the most turbulent and significant decades in American history, and now this decade that we're in now. Imam Jamil is a bridge between the two.
And so, in conclusion, what can people do? And two questions. One, what can people do to help free Imam Jamil? And second of all, what can we do to go back to the way of the Prophet ﷺ, which is the way towards ending racism and starting with the division within our own Muslim community?
One of the things that we can do to help Imam Jamil is become as well informed about his case as we possibly can. And that's the reason why we published this book, The Imprisonment of Imam Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin, Is It a Government Conspiracy? This book has a wealth of information. It's an easy read. It's a compelling read that will help to educate folk who want to know not only who he was, but also the period of struggle that he represents. I mean, this is the most important thing that you can do, is educate yourself.
And how can you get this book?
The book you can get from us by going to our website, AAFIA, AAFIA.org, www.afia.org, and then go to the PayPal link, and just, if you make a donation, we ask for a minimum donation of 20, which covers both the book and the mailing costs. If you want to give more, alhamdulillah, we can use it. It helps to fund our work. But that's how you can get it directly from us. Those who, especially those who are in other parts of the world who see this, you can order it through Amazon and get it that way. We get less of the profit margin for the book when you purchase it on the Amazon platform. So, those who are in a position to get it directly from us, please do. Because again, not only are you getting a compelling read, something that will help you to understand Imam Jamil and the period that he represents all the way up to where we are today, but it will also help to fund the work that we're doing. So that's one of the things that you can do. The other thing is, once you become more informed about this case and who Imam Jamil is and what he represents, you want to start having as many discussions about him as you possibly can. You want each one reach one or two or three or four or five, have forums where you talk about Imam Jamil, his legacy, and what his case represents. And then the next stage is to make a determination to become part of a campaign to help struggle for his freedom. There's a petition drive right now that is underway. You can go to a website, whathappened2rap.com. What happened to rap? And on that website, there's a wealth of information you can access to also educate yourself on Imam Jamil. And then also there's a petition that you can sign, and a petition whose objective is to exert pressure on the state's attorney's office in Atlanta to do what Andrew Young requested that they do, and that is to revisit this case, to reopen this case, and to give Imam Jamil the justice that he deserves.
And again, that was what happened to rap.com. We're gonna display that, and also again, in terms of what can we do in your mindset to go back to the
yes,
pathway to the Prophet ﷺ's pathway and end racism. What are your thoughts about that?
My thought, personally, let me share with you what I do. I rarely use the term racism, and when I do use it, I use it in quotes. Why? Because from an Islamic perspective, in my humble opinion, there is only one race, and that one race is the human race. In terms of human beings on this earth, you correctly pointed out that in the Quran addresses the issue of racism by virtue of two types of beings, the human being and the jinn, Iblis. All right, they represent two different races of beings. But in terms of human beings, there's only one human family. Allah Ta'ala has said in the Quran, in that verse in translation, "O mankind, O humanity, verily the creation of you is," subhanallah, no, wait a minute.
We have created you.
Yeah, we have created you into nations and tribes,
right?
For you to know each other, not for you to despise one another. So I avoid the use of the term racism, except in quotes, and race in quotes. For me, from my perspective, I address these issues of tribes and nations and oppressive tribal affiliations and what have you. And I mean, that's the way I look at it. And I should also point out, Brother Talib, that subhanallah, while I have experienced personally, and you probably have heard about some of these instances, while I have experienced the bigotry that can come from the heart and actions of some of my quote unquote Muslim brethren in different parts of the country. I've had police called on me at conventions, sometimes at masajid. I've had police called on me, okay, for advocating for, our political prisoners, and making the leadership of the organization that's having the convention or the leadership of the masjid uncomfortable. I mean, they have called the police on me, and I've experienced other injustices done. But with that said, on the other side, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this, the vast majority of support that I have received over the past 3 decades of doing this work in America, the vast majority of support have come from my brothers and sometimes sisters of other tribes. The vast majority of support, which has sustained us. And so, the good that I have experienced in terms of Islamic brotherhood has far outweighed the negative.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. So we need to remind each other of that. While we exert pressure on our brethren, and we need to exert pressure on them for their sake, not just for our sake or for the ummah's sake, for their sake. We need to exert pressure on our brethren who behave in this way, who behave in very tribalistic and oppressive ways. We need to exert pressure on them to correct themselves. But at the same time, we do it without burning the bridges and making it impossible for them to be able to correct themselves and come back across the bridge to embrace us as the brothers that we're supposed to be.
Alhamdulillah. Well, I think that this has been a tremendously informative conversation. We've gone over actually about a little bit all beyond the time that we had actually thought that we were going to be ending, but we ask Allah to forgive us and all of you all who have waited so patiently to forgive us. And we appreciate, I want to extend our appreciation to you, Sheikh El-Hajj Mauri Saalakhan. And we look forward to getting your book, and we appreciate your partnership and the partnership of also our other sponsor, and that's the sister Saisa Neal, for your support of this program. Without your support, we couldn't do this, as well as the Abe Legal, a new platform that provides 24-hour legal services to people virtually and affordably. And you can check that out at abe.legal. Dear brother, can you lead us in a closing dua so we can end the program in the spirit in which we began, a spirit of submission and understanding that our only true enemy, as you said, is Satan, and by submitting ourselves to the will of the Almighty and following the great example of the Prophet ﷺ, we can not only end the imprisonment of Imam Jamil Al-Amin, end the oppression of all people, particularly African Americans, but end many of the challenges that we exist in life. Please lead us in a supplication and dua to the Almighty for that grace.
Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdika la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wal asr. Innal insana lafi khusr. Illa alladhina amanu wa amalu salihati. Wa tawassaw bil haqq. Wa tawassaw bis sabr.
Yeah. All right. Well, we look forward to our next episode of The End of Racism. Stand by for our next guest. We appreciate all those who kept with us. Feel free to add any comments or questions that you have for our speakers in our comment section, and we promise to get back to you as soon as possible with a response. Until that time, let us continue to work and pray for the end of the caste system that divides us by race and by tribe. And until that time, we bid you all peace and blessings.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.